welcome to you all. This is the third session on support, which I think is indicative of the fact that it's a really important area of the SOGI asylum experience and framework for people to address. So we've got three panelists today, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time introducing them. I'm just going to start by making a few practical points, sort of housekeeping points, before passing over to them. And then they will each have 15 minutes before we have half an hour for Q&A. Oh, I should have said, my name's Moira Dustin. I'm the UK lead on the SOGICA project, which is the organisation or research project hosting this conference, which I hope you all know about by now. And there's lots of information about the project and this conference as well on our website, www.sogica.org, and you can read up about it there. So I won't say any more about SOGICA for the moment, but just to let you know that in this session we will be recording the session, but only up to the Q&A part. So participants don't need to worry about being seen or heard in the recordings of the panel presentations that we'll be posting on the SOGICA project website in due course, probably by the end of July. And everyone who's registered for the conference will receive an email telling them about that. During the presentations, we'd be very grateful if you would post your comments and questions as we go along using the Q&A function, which you should find at the bottom of your Zoom screen, and then we can allow some time, hopefully 20-25 minutes for discussion at the end of the event. We've also got behind the scenes, concealing herself, Nina Held from the SOGICA project, who is very kindly facilitating this session. And if you do have any problems with anything, or technical problems or requests for information, please do again use the Q&A function to type them in, and she'll be keeping an eye on that. So I think that's all I've got to say from a housekeeping point of view. I mean, I think just in starting, we've got a really fascinating, fantastic lineup of presentations that we've loosely grouped under the heading of support, but they're actually incredibly broad in the geographies that our presenters are going to be speaking from and about, as well as in terms of the kind of support structures that they're going to be discussing. And I think that is very indicative of the very diverse needs of the SOGI claimants that this event is all about. So I'm just going to say a couple of things in very brief biographical introduction to all of our speakers before handing over to them. We're going to take them in the order that they're listed on the programme. So we're going to start with Nicholas Hirsch from the Community Legal Services organisation in Ottawa, and Nicholas also works for Capital Rainbow Refuge. Sorry, I'm making a right mess of that, aren't I? After Nicholas, we're going to hear from Isabel, who is a master's student at the University of Sussex and who's worked very closely with the SOGICA project on a couple of initiatives. And her research dissertation is looking at how SOGI asylum seekers settle in the UK and the government policies that shape their decisions to move. And finally, we're going to hear from Paul Delane, who is the senior advisor at Rainbow Railroad and who is also an expert member of the UK government's LGBT advisory panel. And I wish there was more of an opportunity to hear about that, but another time, eh? Okay, so I'll pass over to you, Nicholas. The floor's all yours.
Okay, great. Thank you for the warm introduction, Maura. I know it's been a very jam-packed 3-day conference, but I'm very excited to be here on this last panel to present to you on Canada's LGBTQ refugee sponsorship program. I think this presentation is really important timely for 2 reasons. First of all is there is an unprecedented demand for LGBTQ refugee resettlement. In its latest Global Needs Assessment report, the UNHCR has identified more than 1.44 million refugees in need of resettlement. And on top of that, studies suggest that there's less than 1% of socio-diverse individuals who manage to find a way to leave their countries of origin and reach a safe haven. So hopefully I can convince you in the next 15 minutes or less that community sponsorship is a potential viable pathway and powerful tool to increase the resettlement of LGBTQ individuals. The second reason why this presentation is really important is that there are over 15 countries that are either exploring or piloting or expanding their own community sponsorship programs. The final draft of the Global Compact on Refugees does call upon states to establish private or community sponsorship groups that are additional to regular resettlement. So I'm hopeful that we can look at the Canadian experience in sponsoring LGBTQ refugees to inform policymaking and program development in other countries, especially in the European Union. Yeah, okay. So with that said, this is the outline of my presentation. I'll begin by explaining in broad strokes the private sponsorship of refugees program in Canada, specifically sponsorship group formation and eligibility. Then I'll outline some key programs and features of LGBTQ refugee sponsorship. Then I'll turn to some of the positive features or success stories, as well as the limitation and challenges that we face in using the private sponsorship of refugees program. And time permitting, I'll provide some concluding remarks and recommendations for countries designing community sponsorship with LGBTQ people in mind. Okay, so in Canada, there are 3 different types of sponsorship groups, 2 of which I'll explain to you today. The first are what are called groups of 5. So generally speaking, this is when at least 5 Canadian citizens or permanent residents get together, they raise a certain amount of money, and they sponsor refugees, meaning they provide the income and settlement assistance. Something important to understand, and we'll see this on the next slide, is that the eligibility of groups of 5 are generally vetted by the Canadian government. In other words, a group of 5 submits their sponsorship application and the Canadian government says, okay, are there enough people? Do you have proof of financial capacity? Do you have a settlement plan in place? And so it's the Canadian government that's determining whether the group is eligible to sponsor. Now, compare this to what are called sponsorship agreement holders, or SAWs, and under them are what are called constituent groups, or CGs. Sponsorship agreement holders are usually, but not always, faith-based organizations who already have the experience in sponsoring refugees. This comes in part due to Canada's history in privately sponsoring refugees. Even before the official provisions on sponsorship came into place in 1979, it was generally faith-based organizations that were providing support to resettle refugees. So when private sponsorship became official in 1979, the Canadian government essentially turned to these organizations and said, look, you're the ones with the expertise and experience in resettling refugees. So if you tell us you have the capacity to sponsor, we'll essentially take your word for it. So when, for example, my group, Capital Rainbow Refuge, is a constituent group of the Canadian Unitarian Congress, which is our SAW. So when we submit an application to sponsor, as long as the SAW is endorsing our application, the Canadian government says, yes, you're eligible to sponsor. So with that said, I'll now turn to the actual requirements to sponsor. So first of all, generally speaking, you need a sufficient number of group members. So in Canada, an individual cannot sponsor refugees. You need to be part of a group. As I mentioned, for a group of 5, this is at least 5 people. For SAWs, depending on the SAW, they may say, you know, 5 people actually isn't enough. From our experience, we think you need to be a group of at least 10 or 15 people to sponsor refugees. Groups also need to show financial capacity. Again, for example, with a group of 5, the Canadian government expects the group to raise the equivalent of 12 months of social assistance based on the provincial prevailing rates. This is generally, I would say, about $16,500. For SAWs, they rightly say that $16,500 for one person is not enough money. Our SAW requires us to have about $19,000 to $20,000 in the bank before we file our sponsorship application. In addition to financial capacity, sponsorship groups must also demonstrate settlement capacity. In other words, who is going to do what to support the refugees once they arrive in Canada? So this would include, for example, helping refugees enroll in school, in language acquisition courses, connecting them with a medical or mental health professional, helping them find employment, generally all the things that people need to do when they arrive in a new country and experience a new culture. And the last group requirement, which actually isn't a requirement by IRCC, is sensitivity training. So again, the government doesn't require this, but for Capital Rainbow Refuge, when we have groups that want to sponsor with us, we do require them to go through a 4-module training program. So this is a training where we teach groups about what to expect when refugees arrived, how to manage expectations, the importance of recognizing power imbalance between sponsored refugees and sponsorship groups, and maintaining privacy and confidentiality, among other things. So we do require our groups to go through this training before they can submit an application that Capital Rainbow endorses. Okay, how does a sponsorship group choose who to sponsor? So this, I'll come back to this point in a minute, but in Canada, groups can actually identify who they want to sponsor. My understanding is other countries with their own community sponsorship programs may not actually have this option, but in Canada, this is really, really important. Especially in the LGBTQ context. For us, a lot of people who sponsor contact us directly, either through Facebook or WhatsApp or by email. And this is really important because for them, they may not feel safe disclosing their SOGI to an on-the-grounds organization or really to anyone else in their communities. So for them, even if they feel unsafe to disclose, we can still find a way to connect with them and see if refugee private sponsorship is an option. Something to note is that if you are a group of 5 and you are selecting who you want to sponsor, those overseas applicants need refugee status recognition documents, usually from the UNHCR or from the host government. This, as you can imagine, is a really big barrier. In some host countries, the UNHCR isn't even allowed to give refugee status recognition documents. So for some LGBTQ sponsorships, groups of 5 just aren't even an option unless, again, they have that refugee status recognition document. Now, what a lot of groups say is, well, SAWS, they don't have this requirement. They can sponsor people without a refugee recognition document, but SAWS have annual caps. In fact, the cap last year was about 10,500 individuals. There are over 105 active SAWs in Canada, again, with multiple constituent groups underneath them. So that cap is usually met very early every year, which means they usually cannot submit additional applications. So again, the first option is for sponsors to identify who they want to sponsor. And again, those applicants still need to meet the Convention refugee criteria. For groups who don't know who they want to sponsor or necessarily particular about it, they can access what's called the Blended Visa Office Referred Refugee List, or BVOR. So this was a program created in 2012. It's considered a tripartite agreement between the UNHCR, the government in Canada, and private sponsorship groups. Essentially, refugees on this list have already been approved and referred by the UNHCR to the Canadian government. The Canadian government has vetted these refugees to meet their own criteria for refugee resettlement and have been approved. And the government wants to connect them with a sponsorship group. So essentially, if you select an individual or family on the BVOR list, one of the big perks is the government of Canada will provide 6 months of income support. So this means that the sponsorship group only needs to provide the other 6 months and then the 12 months of community and social support. Another key feature of the BVOR list is we call these refugees travel-ready refugees in the sense that they've already been vetted and approved. Although obviously from the refugees' perspective, they've been waiting a very long time for a resettlement option. Now, a particular program I want to draw to your attention is the Rainbow Refugee Assistance Partnership. Back in 2010, then Conservative Immigration Minister Jason Kenney called upon the Canadian LGBT community to, quote, step up to the plate and sponsor LGBTQ refugees. Following that call to action, the Conservative government put in place a pilot project called the Rainbow Refugee Assistance Pilot Project. Now, for me, I personally don't identify as a conservative. I've never really agreed with most of their policies as they relate to refugees and immigrants, but this is the one big exception. There are two key features of this pilot project now partnership. The first is the government will provide 3 months of funding. So this is really important, especially for our economically disadvantaged sponsorship groups. It's just less money that they need to fundraise. And the other key feature is, as I mentioned in the last slide, when you sponsor through a SAW, they have a cap. And once that cap is met, they cannot submit additional sponsorships. The Rainbow Wrap provides an exception to the cap. In other words, even if the SAWs have met their cap for that year, as long as they are sponsoring an LGBTQ refugee through this program, that LGBTQ refugee is not subject to that cap. This is something I would characterize as essential to our work, because if that exemption did not exist, I think our program would be totally paralyzed. Now, we've had to do a lot of political lobbying since 2011 to maintain this program. At first, the program was only valid for 1 to 2 years at a time. So this provided a lot of uncertainty for our sponsorship groups who were fundraising, who didn't know if they could submit an application because of the SAW caps. And I'm very pleased to say that last year, the government turned this into a partnership and said the program is valid for 5 years and subject to renewal. So what are some successes in privately sponsoring LGBTQ refugees? The first, as I mentioned before, is this ability to identify refugees as sponsor without requiring UNHCR refugee recognition documents. As we know, the UNHCR in most parts of the world works beyond its capacity. UNHCR tends to hire local staff who may espouse, be perceived to be espousing the same homophobic and transphobic views as refugees, as people from a refugee's country of origin. And as I mentioned before, some UNHCR offices aren't even allowed to give those refugee status recognition documents. So the fact that we can work through a SAW, which means refugees don't need that document, and we're not subject to the caps, is really, really important to our work. And as I mentioned before, because of our expertise and because of our referrals to on-the-ground organizations, we are able to identify refugees that maybe the government of Canada would not be able to identify themselves, because those refugees are not willing to come forward and disclose their SOGI to the UNHCR or Canadian government. Another key success, I would say, is increased resettlement spaces. Since the Rainbow Wrap was introduced in 2011, we will have had over 250 sponsorships by the end of this year. Obviously, this doesn't include LGBTQ sponsorships outside of Rainbow Wrap or refugees that come to Canada in other ways. But I would argue that this is a program that does provide additional resettlement opportunities for LGBTQ refugees. And the last success I'll mention is immediate community support. Many people comment that the private sponsorship of refugees program is just a way to reunite families. And I would actually say that's no different in the LGBTQ context. It's just a family that refugee may have known that they've never had. In fact, with refugee sponsorship, there is that built-in community support once a refugee arrives. We tend to encourage pre-arrival contact, if it's safe enough to do so, obviously, usually through WhatsApp, so that the group and sponsor refugees can get to know each other, manage expectations, and lead to better settlement outcomes. Something also I just want to highlight quickly as an anecdote is, one of our first couples that we sponsored this past year decided they wanted to sponsor their friends. So they, in fact, formed their own sponsorship group, raised money, and their friends were supposed to arrive a couple of weeks ago, but due to COVID-19, their flight was canceled, but they should be arriving soon. So I think community sponsorship is a really nice way to improve the social fabric of Canada, and to give refugees themselves an opportunity to participate in a meaningful way to the protection of other refugees. What are some challenges? Certainly the system is not immune to scrutiny. The first and probably biggest is processing times. So these are the estimated processing times on the Canadian government's website for 4 major host countries. As you can see for Colombia, which hosts a lot of Venezuelan refugees, there isn't even a time estimated. Something to keep in mind is these are the estimated processing times once an application is submitted. So it does not include the amount of time to fundraise. It does not include the amount of time to put an application together. And in the LGBTQ context, you know, I'm kind of preaching to the choir, but LGBTQ refugees are much more highly vulnerable compared to other ones. There are imminent risks of serious harm or even death for refugees in host countries. And these processing times are just simply too long. Moreover, as I kind of mentioned before, the sponsorship obligation is for 12 months once refugees arrive. However, when we know that someone we're sponsoring is in a precarious legal situation or is facing serious discrimination or isn't able to access employment, many groups feel a moral or ethical obligation to provide financial support even before the refugees arrive in Canada. And again, that's not something per se included in the sponsorship agreement. Now, there are tools in the toolbox per se to speed up an application. We've done it before where we ask for expedited processing. We successfully requested to waive the eligibility interview with the Canadian government. There are what I would characterize as humanitarian visas, but it's very much a case-by-case basis and does require quite a bit of lobbying, political lobbying and quiet advocacy. Another key limitation is that private sponsorship does not really address the situation of internally displaced LGBTQ individuals. One of the criteria, as we all know, to be a convention refugee is that you're outside of your country of nationality, and that is also a requirement for privately sponsored refugees. As you probably know, it is very difficult for LGBTQ individuals to exit their countries of origin. There may be financial barriers. It costs money to be able to leave and take a flight somewhere. You may need to be accompanied by a man or your husband if you are a lesbian or gay or bisexual woman. There may be legal barriers. It's not exactly easy to get a visa to a global north country. And so many refugees end up in a neighboring country that is just as homophobic or transphobic as their country of origin. So something we sometimes do is we prepare the application while the LGBTQ individual is in their country of origin. And then once it's almost ready, then they leave and then we submit the application. But that's not really an adequate and safe option to do. Another key challenge is managing expectations, both by the sponsorship group and by the sponsored refugees. So there's a lot of literature out there on what are the different mismanaged expectations. Obviously, when expectations are unreasonable and unmanaged, they can lead to a loss of trust between the groups or even a breakdown in the sponsorship. What I will highlight in the LGBTQ context is sponsorship groups may sometimes expect sponsored refugees to kind of embrace the LGBTQ community. So there's been this kind of reoccurring theme in some of the panels on, you know, the stage identity models, the idea that there's a linear development of sexual identity. And some sponsorship groups do sometimes wonder why the sponsored refugee doesn't want to spend time with them or, you know, spread their wings and fly to the nearest gay bar or join them in the Pride Parade. Obviously some do, but that's not ubiquitous. And then from the sponsored refugees' perspective, many of them believe that they are going to be fully safe and secure once they're in Canada. And while Canada does have a solid reputation for upholding the rights of sexual and gender minorities, the unfortunate reality is that there is racism, xenophobia, misogyny, and homophobia within the quote-unquote LGBTQ community. So that's something that many of our sponsored refugees struggle with, among other things. And last but certainly not least, you know, my day job is an immigration refugee lawyer, often representing asylum seekers. And while there is a lot of support being developed for privately sponsored refugees, I often wonder why this level of support isn't being provided to government-assisted refugees. So these are ones that are supported essentially by the Canadian federal and provincial governments and asylum seekers. As we know, they often arrive with maybe the clothes on their back and nothing more. They may suffer from heightened PTSD and complex trauma. And again, they don't have that built-in community support right away. So Capital Rainbow Refuge, we do support government-assisted refugees and asylum seekers, but it's usually on an ad hoc basis. Usually a settlement agency calls us and says, there's someone that came through our door, can you help us? Our groups, our support groups aren't as large. Usually it's a specific task like housing or employment. And often government-assisted refugees and asylum seekers rely on the assistance of reception centers and settlement agencies. And as has been discussed in previous panels, they may not understand that they have to tailor their services in a certain way so LGBTQ newcomers feel safe and comfortable enough accessing their services. So I'll leave it at that because I think I am over time, but I am certainly happy to take questions afterwards. Thank you.
Thank you, Nicholas. That was absolutely fascinating. I could ask questions all day about that. I'm sorry we don't have time for that, so I'm going to hand over to Isabel, who's going to be talking from a very different perspective. But I know a little bit about her work, and I know it's just as fascinating. Isabel, over to you.
Thank you so much, Maya. Nicholas, thank you so much for that amazing presentation on the Canadian sponsorship program. It's awesome. I think my presentation will hopefully piggyback well off of yours because I'm going to be focusing today mostly on the United States case, in particular with transgender refugees in detention here. As Mara stated, I'm a master's student at the University of Sussex, and I've been doing a placement with the Sojika team, who have been absolutely wonderful in supporting my research and giving guidance. And I'm very happy to say that in the coming weeks or so, a map that I have just created that shows SOGI applicants in the UK based on countries of origin will be published to the Sojika website. It's going to be a little interactive way to kind of visualize a lot of the information you're getting in this conference in a new way. And so with that, I'm going to share my screen and get my presentation going here. Let's see. That's showing now. Oh, good. Okay, so this presentation is going to focus on the US case, as I said, considering the current situation in the States with the death of George Floyd and the Black Lives Matter protests. I think it's really important right now to kind of highlight what's going on in our prison and detention system. And in addition to the limited time frame I have here, I would rather do a good job talking about one case and do justice to that. So I just want to thank you all so much for having me today. And I'm honored to be here and to be able to present some of the work that transgender activists all over the world are doing. So I'm going to start off with a little introduction about my background, which is in kind of advocacy around getting representation for immigrants in detention centers in the United States, which is how I got into this research in the first place, and the specific case of transgender refugees within US detention. Building off of that, we'll go into a little bit about governmentality and the transnational networks that transgender refugees really rely upon when they're trying to navigate a very complex system that really is not working in their favor. And then finally going into the case study of Alejandra Barrera and some positive changes that we've seen as a result of trans activism in the States. So as I said, I worked a little bit in trying to get representation for immigrants in detention in the States while I was working for this nonprofit called WIDEN, the Washington Immigrant Defense Network. And working with them, we talked a lot about invisible walls. Obviously, with Trump's propaganda, we've had a lot of talk in the media recently about the wall, expanding the wall, and reinforcing that state border. And here we have a picture of the border in Southern California, where I'm based right now. But actually behind the scenes, what's happening is a systematic backlog of immigration cases. You were seeing delays as long as 5 years for asylum seekers and other immigrants to have their first hearings. And as of now, only about 14% of detained immigrants nationwide actually have representation when they go into their hearings, which can potentially be life or death, especially in the case of LGBT individuals who are applying for asylum. Of course, having that representation makes a huge difference. And so it's really important to be able to facilitate this. So as of new immigration guidelines, the congressional mandate requires ICE to hold 34,000 immigrants who may be subject to removal procedures in more than 250 detention facilities nationwide. A lot of these are privately run and for-profit enterprises. Interestingly, prior to 1996, immigrants in removal proceedings were not detained unless they were found to be a flight risk. And multiple studies show that actually asylum seekers tend to show up for their hearings regardless of if they're in detention or not, because obviously when you come to a country fleeing persecution, the last thing you want is to end up undocumented and without access to the rights that they had before. So this arguably is a bit unnecessary, or seriously unnecessary and unethical. But while the average detainee stays in US detention centers for 30 days, asylum seekers stay much, much longer, the average being 102 days, as you can see there. For transgender asylum applicants, this is often double that length because of obviously the complex nature of their cases. And within the detention center, we're seeing a lot of systematic mistreatment of SOJI refugees trying to get their claims across. So to give a little bit of background, a lot of things have changed obviously under the Trump administration. And in 2019, he asked for $800 million to support 8,000 new immigration detention beds for a total of 52,000 beds for immigration related issues. Now, as these are civil cases, I think it's really important to emphasize that these people are not guaranteed representation when they go into their court cases. In the case of criminal cases, obviously in the States here, we have the public defender model where people are more or less guaranteed a lawyer. If they can't afford it, it won't be a good one, it'll be a government funded lawyer on probably a very small stipend. However, at least they'll have someone. And this doesn't always happen for immigrants. And so it becomes very important matter to try to get representation. And that's exactly what the nonprofit I was working with back in 2018 was doing, trying to basically fund immigration lawyers to represent people in deportation proceedings. So in an effort to represent themselves, considering their kind of extremely impoverished condition in detention centers where a lot of their human rights are routinely trampled. In June of 2019, 29 transgender inmates wrote a letter complaining about the medical care they were receiving and the mistreatments they received under ICE custody. So really a lot of the things that we're seeing changes kind of start with the transgender refugee activist community in the fact that even in detention, they were able to write a letter and publicize this letter through nonprofit activists, obviously outside the system and other LGBTQ groups. And a year later, House Democrats picked this movement up and they recently submitted a letter to the Department of Homeland Security and ICE, formally asking them to release all transgender detainees from their custody. Detention has been shown to be extremely detrimental to mental health of people held there. So in addition to medical mistreatment, even under the best of conditions, obviously it's not good for one's mental health to flee to a new country seeking protection and refuge and then to be trapped in a jail-like facility that basically these are, in fact, the same companies that run our jails are the same ones that run detention facilities. So before we delve a little bit more into the case studies, I wanted to just take a step back and to look at the importance of the case of transgender refugees in a more holistic sense. Theorist Jules Gleason, who has just written some beautiful things on the position of trans migrants in particular, points out the fact that transgender refugees and migrants in general are both kind of targeted by the far right as people who threaten the family and the nation, challenging heteronormative expectations of family and reproduction, as well as the expectations that people will more or less stay within their country of origin. And so as these people who go through different and entities throughout their life, on both the gendered level and the national level. She says, there's no accident that trans and migrants share the dubious honor of being points of fixation for the far right. Transition and migration are both situated at the intersection of where national imaginaries cross individual ones. For borders to remain natural, they should be crossed only in exceptional circumstances. And the very lived experience of transgender refugees reveals a certain mutability in which anyone can interact with the world. So it's, I think, particularly important to focus, in a sense, on transgender refugees because they inhabit this very kind of special place that reveals a lot more about the immigration system on a wider level. So the field of migrations policy, we've talked a lot about Foucault in this conference, throughout the course of this conference, draws on Foucault's ideas about governmentality, that being power is not exercised necessarily in the top-down approach, but is present in all aspects of society and is regulated by norms, expectations, discourses that regulate what's expected of someone in a particular gender from a particular place. Walters in 2004 argues that this process can be seen in migration politics that invoke the image of the state as a home, and this home that needs to be protected. According to him, increasingly enforced borders are justified through this idea of protecting the nation home from outsiders that could threaten the established order. If we see it like this, we can understand asylum, accommodation, and detention become places where we can domesticize newcomers. And I hate this term, but equally, I think it really strikes a chord when we see that 97%, that LGBTQ migrants in detention are 97% more likely to be sexually assaulted in detention than other migrants. There's this kind of expectation in detention of regulation, of recreating this hierarchy and enforcing the expected norms of society. And people need to go along with these expectations, or else they experience severe mistreatment. So I want to point out the story of, just highlight Alejandra Barrera's story because she's a really inspirational woman who was actually held in detention for almost 2 years in New Mexico. She's from El Salvador, and there she regularly visited ill AIDS patients in hospitals and was a very active member of the transnational transgender community, working with a lot of nonprofits and support groups. As a result, she was kind of found by the Salvadoran military and criminal gangs and targeted due to her activism. And there, she fled to the United States, leveraging the connections that she'd made with a lot of trans organizations throughout the Americas. And I think I want to re-emphasize the importance of these transnational connections and the importance of nonprofits and advocacy groups, because it's really through these connections that migration pathways are enabled. Obviously, it's not great when you arrive in a host country, a so-called safe country, and are then subject to more abuse through the detention system. But regardless, throughout this, Alejandra was in touch with advocacy groups outside of detention, sending letters, facilitating letters and the voices of other trans migrants in detention with her. And kind of through these networks was really what allowed her parole and release, and also to share her story, which gained a lot of traction. So Alejandra was detained at Cibola County Correctional Facility, which is one of many privately run for-profit detention centers run by the company CoreCivic, which has seen a huge increase in share values since Trump was elected, unsurprisingly. And this year, the revenue is expected to be about $2 billion. Today, as of January of this year, they've moved about 27 transgender asylum seekers from this facility due to all the bad press it was receiving. That's not to say that the people who were moved went to a different place, but it is to say that the activism on behalf of Alejandra, and as well as the advocacy that happened after the death of Roxana Hernandez Rodriguez, who died in this facility in 2018. It's to say that the press that goes around these networks that share this information do actually have make an impact, to the point where ICE has had to move inmates from this, or detainees from this location. I also want to make a point that the photos I selected here are just a few photos of the facility, but ICE actually in 2017 took photos and posted a whole bunch of photos on their website that later got replicated in the press, showing the kind of the cafeteria and the gym and the hair salon in the facility, and kind of painting a pretty picture of what actually happens on the inside of detainment camps. Less than a week later, the detainees there actually wrote a letter saying that's not reality, and actually although these facilities exist here, they're usually not open, they're usually not run. So I just want to take this moment to say as well, when we're looking at facts about immigration worldwide, to really go to the source, to go to the people who are in the centers and listen to their voices and listen to what their experiences, and to support them in that, rather than just taking photos found at face value. So I wanted to kind of put a face to a name. This is Alejandra, and this is the call script that was publicized hugely on social media, asking people to call in and say, look, free Alejandra, and give her a chance to actually, be free while her case is pending. And here's another one announcing the good news. This is Out Magazine on Twitter. 44-year-old transgender refugee was released on parole on Friday after spending 21 months in immigration and customs enforcement facility. So a kind of rare success story, but one that we can take a lot from, I think, in figuring out how to mobilize in order to kind of put pressure on governments to be humane, more or less. It's also, I want to also note that because transgender individuals experience such high instances of sexual assault and harassment and lack of medicine, and also don't necessarily have the support of fellow asylum seekers when they're in facilities that that include everyone. Currently, there's only one currently operating detention facility that's specifically for transgender migrants. But although ICE doesn't release figures, presumably most transgender migrants and asylum seekers are held with other refugees, and of course they're put at risk due to the fact that a lot of people in their similar situations might be homophobic. They might be detained with the same people who are initiating the transphobia and violence against them in the first place. And so as a result of this, a lot of times solitary confinement is used to kind of protect trans refugees in these conditions. But obviously, this has horrible impacts on mental health. So just to reiterate, transgender asylum seekers, in my opinion, and I think in order to be humane and to follow human rights law, should not be detained and should rather be free to show up to their asylum hearings and have a fair trial in this way. So Barrera was released in September following an intense campaign spearheaded by Amnesty International, the Trans-Latin Coalition, and the National Immigrant Justice Center. A bunch of lawmakers were included in this, and over 30,000 signatures facilitated her freedom. In less than a month, she was back in DC sharing her story with lawmakers and advocates for the release of other transgender women in immigration jail. As one of the people who was working very closely with her, Denise Bell, researcher at Amnesty International, said she really touched the hearts of so many people. And it was really incredible to see how congressional pressure and public pressure really did stop her deportation. There were a few moments where her deportation was scheduled and kind of for imminent decision, and thanks to the support of the public and the advocacy of so many lawmakers, that she was able to be released. And in a statement, she thanked, "Through letters of support, people from around the world gave the strength to continue in the struggle that was so hard for me. I'm here to keep fighting," she said. And this is kind of a theme that's repeated so much that I've heard from all transgender refugees that I have talked to as well, that there's this real need to keep fighting and to be advocates. I have a short video. I don't know if, do we have time? I think we have time.
I think, Isabel, I think we probably don't, just because we're going to, we don't have capacity to run over on this session before the final keynote speech. So,
Moira, I don't mind taking a few minutes. It'd be nice to hear.
Okay. That's very kind of you. Thank you, Paul. Go for it, Isabel.
Thank you. Let's see, how do I get back? There we go. So this is just the video of Alejandra's release back in September.
Pues gracias a todas las personas, a toda la comunidad que estuvo conmigo en este largo proceso, a Bambi, Amnistía Internacional, Alma Rosa, mi consejera, mi amiga, mi hermana, todo, Joeli, contestándome siempre el teléfono, pues no tengo cómo agradecerles, a mi abogada Rebeca, a Tania Linares, gracias, y aquí estoy en pie de lucha.
Okay, and I think I'll close with that. I think despite the fact that transgender refugees go through so much in detention, her story really highlights how her activism and the activism of the community around her and the kind of publicity and movement of lawmakers, of regular people in signing that her petition kind of goes to show that with a lot of support there, it's possible to put pressure on ICE, on Congress, on our governments to really create the kind of humane immigration environment that we want in our countries. Yeah, and that this doesn't just affect transgender refugees either. I think this idea of governmentality and domesticization of immigrants through detention, but also through a very regressive immigration policies, affects regular people too. I have friends even who just married into the country and are waiting citizenship claims, and even they feel that they can't go to protests. Even they can't feel that they can't really campaign for what they want because they're too worried about, they're really worried about losing their status, and that's acceptable. So it's really on us as people who have full status and kind of the privileges that come with that to campaign on their behalf. So thank you so much, Paul, and I'll hand it over to you.
That was brilliant. Thank you, Isabel. Over to you, Paul.
Thanks very much. I used to be the refugee researcher at Amnesty, and I'm still involved in the organisation, so it's great to see them supporting Alejandra and your excellent presentation, and Nicholas as well, which covers some of the points that I was going to mention, so I won't repeat them for the sake of time, but thanks to Sojika for giving Rainbow Railroad the opportunity to speak here. I'm Paul Delane, the Senior Advisor. It was actually Devon Matthews, our Head of Casework, who was going to be leading this session, but she has unfortunately been called away. The reason we wanted to put refugee resettlement on the agenda was that the discourse globally, and particularly in Europe, tends to focus on asylum for obvious reasons. It tends to focus on issues of refugee status determination and law and process. Whereas actually refugee resettlement has emerged as an increasingly important mechanism for LGBTI people at risk. Some countries have stepped up to the plate, as Nicholas mentioned, as have other communities via private or community sponsorship means to facilitate safe and legal pathways for people to escape a situation of risk, of persecution, and find safety. Those mechanisms are important. They are too few and far between, and they are now profoundly under threat. And we take the view that we need more safe and legal pathways at this time, not fewer. I do have a presentation. I think Nina is going to help. I'll leave that to Nina. Just a few slides. So there are three main things that I'd like to address in this presentation. One, to look at existing standards and resources in relation to refugee resettlement. Two, identifying best practice, what the research and advocacy needs might be arising out of that. And three, how COVID has affected the situation and how it's likely to have an effect for the foreseeable future. And within the presentation, I think there are three important themes that need to be illustrated and discussed a great deal more. One, the point that I made about refugee resettlement. It's certainly my experience of working with individuals, whether it was in refugee law or via some of the NGOs that I mentioned, that the experiences of violence within all stages of the displacement cycle, including moving from country to country, can be profound and extremely violent and traumatic. It underscores that moving to seeking a place of safety as an LGBTI person on the move is an extremely hazardous and dangerous journey. Instances of economic exploitation, harassment, physical or even sexual violence during that displacement cycle underscore why the profound impact of borders, the externalization of those borders, and the few and far between mechanisms which exist for those at risk to access safety are only compounding and exacerbating the effects of violence. To the point made by Nicholas, the number of IDPs globally far exceeds the number of refugees who crossed an international border. And yet our understanding of the experiences of IDPs who are LGBTI is limited, and there are major gaps in research and understanding. Three, I'd just like to briefly note the experiences of human rights defenders. And whilst 20 or more years since the UN Declaration on Human Rights Defenders and all of the important work that has been done to create standards, mechanisms, systems, the mandate of the UN Special Rapporteur on HRDs, the temporary relocation mechanisms which exist do not fully respond to the long-term needs and risks that human rights defenders face, and that refugee regimes actually may provide complementary and effective solutions, but all too often it is the case that human rights defenders who seek asylum, even after having been invited into a temporary mechanism, experience some or even all of the issues that we've heard about throughout the conference: delay, disbelief, degrading questions, detention, poverty, exclusion, the inability to sustain their activism because of additional obstacles while in exile. In 2017, the academics Lee Badgett and Philip Crehan attempted to articulate what the research priorities might be for the LGBTI movement globally, and in doing so, highlighted the fact that despite the rapid growing awareness of this issue, LGBTI people within forced displacement and all of the great work that we've heard throughout the conference, there are still profound gaps in our knowledge. I hope this presentation might offer something in terms of where this issue might sit within advocacy research priorities. Rainbow Railroad was founded to respond to these situations. We work to respond proactively and urgently to LGBTI people who are at risk, who can reach out to the organization via a safe and secure mechanism, and we can provide resources, assistance, to either relocate them within their country to a place of safety on a short-term basis, whilst looking for more durable solutions, or internationally. And since 2006, it has resettled 800 people from a range of countries internationally. We work with UNHCR operations nationally and regionally. So the persons we may relocate may be already within a system that, as Nicholas mentioned, is overwhelmed, limited resources, and subject to lengthy delay. But Rainbow Railroad can step in with the additional resources and additionally our contacts within the LGBTI civil society movement to respond proactively. It may be that the person who is at risk is not known to UNHCR. It may be that they are a human rights defender who is in the midst of harassment, a crackdown, and we can respond more appropriately. Some of you may have seen the Welcome to Chechnya documentary, which aired on the BBC and HBO last week. And I think this documentary, which recounts the terrible campaign of persecution against LGBT people in Chechnya from 2017 onwards, underscores precisely some of these issues. Although many of the survivors were relocated at great risk to them and the activists who did so from the region to Moscow, spirited away in safe houses across the capital. My colleague Amali Powell, who was there on the ground to provide assistance to the LGBT Russian network in identifying and facilitating those safe houses, the prospects in the short to medium term were extremely few. And the reality was, if these survivors did not leave the country, the risk of reprisal, the risk of honor killing, even from their families, was great. But what mechanism would assist the Chechens to cross a border? To do so themselves with no resources would be almost insurmountable. And as was later publicized and made known via the press, many of the Chechens were relocated from Russia internationally. It's no secret many of them are in North America, but also elsewhere. The point has been made also during the conference that by Nicholas just a few moments ago, that even in exile, one may struggle to find safety, security, or even inclusion. This is also an issue we mustn't forget in terms of designing responses that seek to provide pathways for those at risk. It's important to absolutely build systems with those with lived experience, with human rights defenders and leaders that respond fully and holistically to their needs in the future. I mentioned on Monday that, certainly my view, that as we approach the 70th anniversary of the Refugee Convention, it seems to be under the most profound threat. It is a mechanism that has evolved through interpretation of law and by the courts to include our community after decades of outright denial or exclusion. But the numbers globally, if we can go to the next slide, are substantial and rising year in, year out. And we've now topped 80 million people around the globe forcibly displaced, 1% of humanity. And of those 26 million or so refugees who have been forcibly displaced, including huge numbers of Syrians, but also Venezuelans, a crisis much neglected internationally. The number of IDPs displaced within a country who have not crossed their national border far, far exceeds the number of refugees. And yet, as I mentioned earlier, our understanding of their situation, let alone access, can be incredibly limited. And related to this, the number of those who are able to access resettlement is profoundly small. Of the 1.4 million people assessed to be in urgent need of refugee resettlement in 2019, only 5% were resettled internationally by some 20 countries. And although UNHCR and IOM announced on the occasion of World Refugee Day a couple of weeks ago that the suspension, for the first time in history, of refugee resettlement has been removed and resettlement has resumed, to where and for whom and in what volume, we don't know. And it remains to be seen which countries that have made commitments to refugee resettlement will continue to uphold those commitments in this current climate, in the months to come, and whether other countries will also step up to the plate. The point that I made about the threat to the Refugee Convention on Monday, which I take no pleasure in making that point, but it seems difficult to argue that the Refugee Convention and respect for it is in good health, was actually made much more substantively yesterday by Gillian Triggs, the newly appointed Assistant High Commissioner for Protection. And I'd urge you all to take some time to read her speech yesterday, which I think is a major intervention in this issue, where she describes the current situation as being the most profound threat to the international refugee protection, refugee law, and fundamental human rights principles in 7 decades. She cites the almost entire closure of borders globally, in effect crippling the right to seek asylum because people can't actually cross those borders. Examples of asylum seekers being denied disembarkation, or even pushbacks in the Mediterranean and the Andaman Seas, where boatloads of asylum seekers have been pushed back into the waters and have absolutely resulted in the deaths of individuals. Some states have suspended the right to seek asylum, and I think that this is very significant. UNHCR say, as a matter of fact, refugees have been returned to a place of persecution, in contrary to the principle of the absolute principle of non-refoulement during the COVID crisis. And so I think that that is a very significant intervention. On the 24th of June, Filippo Grandi, the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, called on states urgently step up to provide more in terms of durable solutions. If we could go to the next slide, please, Nina. As we've seen over the last decade or more, the number of people forcibly displaced has more than doubled. And if we can go to the next slide. So what exists in terms of resources and standards? I think the cornerstone of the international protection regime in relation to this issue is the resettlement assessment tool, first produced in 2013, revised and updated in 2019. But of course, UNHCR is not a benign actor in this regard. As Nicholas mentions, it has a role to play, not only in terms of providing support and assistance, but also assessment. In some countries, it may be prevented from issuing those certificates, but all of the issues that we mentioned around delay, inclusion, disbelief, and prejudice can also and do affect UNHCR operations nationally and regionally. And I think it was a very good initiative on the part of UNHCR in 2016 to scrutinize itself and to put on the table its deficiencies in respect of these issues. And many of you will know the report on the right-hand side. Next slide, please. I mentioned on Monday briefly, how am I doing for time? That during the midst of this crisis, Rainbow Railroad has attempted to capture a snapshot of the experiences of LGBTI people who are forcibly displaced. That includes IDPs, asylum seekers, refugees, and those who have been resettled recently. And if you haven't seen the report, I hope you'll take the time to look it up. It is one of the few, the commentary on LGBTI people and COVID and forced displacement at this time is very limited, and the discourse needs to increase. One of the cases that we will include in our follow-up report shortly is that of a trans woman from Egypt who I met in Thailand, who I visited in detention in the country, who's been detained in a men's immigration detention centre in what were shocking conditions, I must say. And following an intervention personally by the Ambassador of Australia, she was resettled to Australia before the borders closed. I mentioned Australia specifically on Monday. It funded Yogyakarta Principles. It is active internationally in fora on LGBTI issues. It did resettle this trans woman who was living in a precarious situation, and there seem to be few durable solutions in Thailand, a country that has no functioning asylum system. And yet, of course, there is a limit to the degree to which we can praise Australia given its treatment of asylum seekers within the country and also offshoring, to say the least. But of our 4 recommendations, if we can go to the next slide, we urge countries to reopen refugee resettlement processes as soon as is reasonably practical. It is not the case that global mobility stands at 0. People are moving around the world, whether they are diplomats, the military, even business people now, I hear, have been given priority access to some countries as opposed to the general population. As UNHCR has said, there are ways and means to facilitate safely the movement of refugees who have already been deemed necessary for resettlement. 7,000 people were awaiting departure at the point that it was suspended, as Nicholas also mentioned, including many LGBTI people. I spoke to a lawyer from Chaos, Haria, a long-standing colleague in this field, who has numerous LGBTI people, mostly gay men and trans women from Iran and Syria, who are waiting to board flights and now live in a situation of uncertainty and limbo. In addition to refugee resettlement, there are other ways and means, of course, that countries can respond, whether it's via the issuing of humanitarian or discretionary visas, work-study options, family reunion. And I touched earlier on the point of human rights defenders, so whether it's the EU mechanism, protectoffenders.eu, or in Britain we have a mechanism via which human rights defenders at risk can come for temporary respite. It is only that. There is an expectation they would stay for a couple of months and then leave. But that, of course, does nothing to respond to the situation on the ground if it is one at risk. And I mentioned far too often, and actually on a widespread scale, we see human rights defenders who are compelled to seek asylum because they face no other option and yet experience all of the issues that we face, even though they have already been recognised as a human rights defender at risk by the government in question via the issuing of that visa. Although I won't delve into the field in too much detail, I mentioned that despite the emergence, the system that exists globally around human rights defenders, they are also at profound risk. Prior to the crisis and COVID, frontline defenders reported 304 human rights defenders globally were killed in 2019, which is a record number. And they recorded over 900 violations, other violations of human rights defenders, which they say themselves can only be the tip of the iceberg. And recently, the UN Special Rapporteur on Migrants and his colleague on human rights defenders observed that those advocating for the rights of migrants and migrant leaders themselves are facing increasing challenges. And that was before COVID. During this crisis, of course, we have seen civil society come under attack. I was very intrigued to see Gillian praise Uganda which has reopened its borders, meaning that refugees fleeing other countries in that region can come into Uganda, and Uganda does have a long history of providing access to people on the move. And yet it is simultaneously the case that large numbers of LGBTI people flee Uganda every year because of the widespread discrimination and harassment and violence within the country. And indeed, in March, an LGBT shelter in Kampala was raided by police, and those 20 individuals who are now housed in safe houses supported by Rainbow Railroad and organisations in Kampala are IDPs within the country, and their future remains precarious and uncertain at this time. I do think that it is for our community to increasingly advocate on this issue. In 2015, when Syrian refugees and the contribution of the UK was being discussed, the fact that previously David Cameron had called for airstrikes against ISIS in Syria, and at the dispatch box in the House of Commons had cited their actions in throwing gay men, actual or perceived, from buildings as a barbaric medieval atrocity. Britain contributed little at the time in terms of tangible, durable solutions, though it was a substantial donor in terms of humanitarian aid. Initially resistant to accept any Syrians fleeing the country, of which few claim asylum in the UK, the government at that time initially proposed 500. And what changed was the politics and the public revulsion at the conditions which led to the death of Aylan Kurdi. And that picture of that child washed up on the Mediterranean galvanized public opinion to show that there was a critical mass of people in this country in favour of doing more. And David Cameron announced the Syrian Refugee Resettlement Scheme, 20,000 people. My former organisation, UK LGIG, at the time warned that without specific additional and inclusive measures, LGBTI people would not benefit from that scheme, for all of the reasons of exclusion that we've been discussing this week. And though that scheme has provided a lifeline to many, many of the most vulnerable people, its contribution for LGBTI people, including those who are most at risk and marginalised in Lebanon, Jordan and Turkey, has been marginal. That's not to say that I'm advocating in favour of a quota. I'm not necessarily in favour of quotas either. But whilst the government under Boris Johnson has announced a new consolidated refugee scheme, which will widen the geographical scope and also eligibility, which we should welcome, and I know NGOs in this country will work hard to make sure it's a success. If those who are most at risk, including LGBTI people, are excluded or do not access, can't access its life-saving, that life-saving opportunity, then it's not fully achieving its objectives. I'm going to leave it there. The final thing I would say is, as UNHCR global consultations are coming up in 2021, postponed from this year, I think it is vital that the full plethora of issues relating to forced displacement globally are on the agenda. In 2010, the global consultation was virtually entirely, actually, lawyers from Europe who were discussing these issues with the UNHCR. That cannot be the case the next time. And although the right to seek asylum and inclusion within refugee law and refugee processes is critical, these wider issues must also be on the agenda. And human rights defenders of lived experience and leaders within the community who lived these experiences should be at the table as well. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Paul. That was fantastic.